Elliot sat down, trying to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach. James's tone was warm, but the weight of the situation still lingered. "What's going on, James?" Elliot asked, keeping his voice steady. "You sounded serious on the phone." James raised an eyebrow but smiled again. "It's not bad news, I promise. Actually, it's quite the opposite." Elliot relaxed slightly, leaning forward. "Then why all the secrecy?" James leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with appreciation. "Well, the truth is I've been noticing some real changes, not just in the way you're leading your team, but in the overall shift in our company culture. You've been steering the ship in a new direction, and it's paying off." Elliot blinked in surprise. "I didn't expect you to say that." James chuckled. "I know. I don't always show it, but I've been watching. And I've been impressed by how you've handled yourself, especially in the last few months." Elliot shifted in his seat, the tension slowly dissipating. "Thank you, James. That means a lot." James leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "Which is why I want to offer you something, a new role within the company. We've been talking a lot about long-term vision, about leadership in this company, and you've demonstrated everything we're looking for." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of role are you talking about?" "A promotion of sorts," James replied, his eyes serious but filled with respect. "I want you to take over as head of operations for the entire company. It's a big step, and it won't be easy, but I believe you're ready for it." For a moment, Elliot didn't know how to respond. His mind raced, unsure whether he'd heard James correctly. "Head of operations?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure about this?" James nodded firmly. "Absolutely. I've seen the way you've transformed, and I'm confident that you're the right person for this. You've already demonstrated your ability to empower others, lead by example, and build trust. And that's exactly what this role demands." Elliot sat back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind. This was everything he had wanted, everything he had worked toward since the day he had started changing his behavior. But it also came with immense responsibility. The weight of the decision began to settle on his shoulders. "I'll need some time to think about it," Elliot said, his voice quieter than usual. "This is a huge change, and I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing, not just for me but for the team." James nodded understandingly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But know that the offer is on the table. And when you're ready, we'll discuss the next steps." Elliot stood up, his mind still spinning. "Thank you, James. I'll let you know soon." As he walked out of James's office, his heart raced. This was everything he had hoped for, but it felt like a turning point, a crossroads where he would have to leave behind the old Elliot for good. The pressure mounted as he thought about what this new role would mean not just for his career, but for the people he had worked so hard to empower. Later that evening, Elliot sat at his kitchen table, the stillness of the apartment giving him the space to think. His phone sat beside him, messages from his colleagues unread, as he stared at the glass of water in front of him. The decision felt monumental. Could he handle this new responsibility? Was he ready to take on a role that would demand so much from him? He thought back to the first meeting he had ever had with Sophie, when he had dismissed her without a second thought. He had been so consumed with his own ideas, his own ego, that he hadn't even seen the potential for change that lay right in front of him. But now, as he looked at his life and the relationships he had built, he realized how far he had come. And perhaps, just perhaps, this role would be the next step in the journey. A journey that had already proven to be so much more than he could have imagined. Taking a deep breath, Elliot grabbed his phone and sent a quick message to James. "James, I've thought about it and I'm ready. I want to take on the head of operations role." His finger hovered over the send button for a moment before he pressed it, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. The next day, Elliot walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the promotion still hung in the air, but it wasn't overwhelming, it was invigorating. As he sat at his desk, he reflected on the journey he had taken. He had gone from being a man defined by arrogance and control to someone who now understood the true power of humility and collaboration. As the morning wore on, Sarah stopped by his desk. "Elliot," she said, her voice quiet but with a hint of excitement. "I heard the news." Elliot smiled, his gaze softening as he looked up at her. "Yeah, it's official now. I'm taking over as head of operations." "That's amazing," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "You've earned it." Elliot shrugged slightly, a modest smile on his face. "It's not just about me. We've built something together, and this new role is just another way to keep growing." Sarah nodded, her voice sincere. "I'm really happy for you, Elliot. I know you'll do great things." As she walked away, Elliot's heart swelled with gratitude. His relationships with his team had become so much more than professional. They were built on mutual respect, trust, and a shared commitment to growth. The promotion wasn't just a recognition of his hard work, it was a recognition of the work they had all done together. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, planning, and strategy sessions. Elliot threw himself into the new role, knowing it was more than just a title. It was a chance to continue to lead with integrity, to keep lifting others up, and to make the company a place where everyone could thrive. He found himself reflecting often on his journey, on the pivotal moments that had shaped him. From the first confrontation with Sophie Morgan to the quiet moments of growth, he had learned that true leadership wasn't about domination, it was about inspiration. It wasn't about the control you held over others, it was about the trust you built with them. And as Elliot stood before his team during his first full leadership meeting as head of operations, he realized that the greatest achievement wasn't the promotion, it was the journey that had led him to this point. A journey that was far from over, but one that had made him into the leader he had always aspired to be. The boy's mind raced. Was this real? Could someone like him, someone so used to rejection, really have a chance? Was this the moment his life would change? And as he looked into the woman's eyes, he knew something deep within him had just begun. The stranger's cruel laughter no longer held power over him. It was only the beginning of something far greater. He would learn. He would rise. And the world would see him for what he truly was, someone capable of achieving his dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed. The boy's heart raced as the woman's words hung in the air, like a lifeline thrown to him in a sea of uncertainty. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His breath was shallow, and his thoughts tumbled over one another in a whirlwind of hope and disbelief. Could it be true? Could someone like him, someone who had been written off by the world, really have a chance? The woman watched him, her expression kind but unwavering. She seemed to understand the conflict inside him, as if she had seen it before in others who had dared to dream. "I know it sounds hard to believe," she said gently, her voice soothing. "But sometimes all it takes is someone to see your potential, to offer a hand when everyone else has turned away." The boy looked at her, his eyes searching for any hint of insincerity, but there was none. Her gaze was steady, her presence calm yet commanding. She wasn't just offering him a false promise. No, there was something about her, something real, something he couldn't quite grasp yet, but that made him feel a flicker of hope. "I don't know what to say," he stammered, still unsure if this was some kind of trick. "Why would you want to help me?" The woman smiled as if she had been expecting that question. "Because I've been where you are," she said quietly. "I was once someone no one believed in. But I had people who took a chance on me. And now I do the same for others." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, which she handed to him. The boy took it cautiously, as if it might disappear at any moment. The envelope was unmarked, no name or address, just a plain white envelope with a single sheet of paper inside. "Take this," she said. "It's an invitation. Go to the address on it. The people there will understand." He hesitated before taking the paper from the envelope. The handwriting was neat, precise, but it meant nothing to him. He looked up, but the woman had already started to walk away. "Who are you?" the boy called after her. The woman turned briefly, a faint smile on her lips. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. "Just don't let fear keep you from the opportunity that lies ahead. And remember, your dream is yours to claim, not anyone else's." Before he could say another word, the woman disappeared into the crowd. The boy stood there, staring at the envelope in his hands, the world around him seeming to fade away as he considered what to do next. The street sounds, the chatter of passers-by, the distant cries of street vendors, All of it seemed distant. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the envelope, and the possibility that his dream, the one that had seemed so out of reach, was finally within grasp. That night, the boy sat in his small corner, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the cracked walls around him. He held the envelope close to his chest, the papers still untouched. His mind raced with possibilities. Who was this woman? And who were the people she had spoken of? Those who would offer him a chance. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper, reading the address written in flowing script. It was in a part of the city he had only heard of in stories, a district where the wealthy and powerful lived, where dreams seemed to be within reach for those who had the right connections. For a moment, he thought about the man who had laughed at his dreams just days earlier. Could he prove that cruel stranger wrong? Could he really rise above his circumstances? Without thinking twice, he stood up, stuffing the letter into his pocket and snuffing out the candle. He had made his decision. It wasn't just about the woman's offer anymore. It was about him. About his belief that he deserved more than a life of hardship. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, the boy made his way through the winding streets, following the directions on the letter. His heart pounded as he passed through neighborhoods that seemed so different from the alleyways he knew. The houses grew larger, more elaborate, the streets cleaner, more polished. He had never been to this part of the city before. He barely recognized the luxury and opulence that surrounded him, but it felt right. When he arrived at the address, he stopped in front of a large, imposing door. It stood tall, made of dark wood, with intricate carvings that hinted at wealth beyond his understanding. A stone lion's head grinned at him from above, a symbol of power and prestige. He hesitated, taking a deep breath before raising his hand to knock. Before he could do so, the door swung open on its own, revealing a tall man dressed in a dark suit. He didn't look like someone from the streets. His face was stern, but his eyes were kind, as though he had seen this kind of situation before. "Come in," the man said, his voice low and welcoming. "You're expected." The boy stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling. Was this real? He had come all this way, but now that he was here, he wasn't sure if he could step forward. The man took a step back, motioning for him to enter. "It's not too late," the man said, as though reading his mind. "If you want the chance you seek, you must take it. Come in." The boy swallowed hard, stepping inside. The house was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the floor covered in plush carpets. Soft lighting bathed the room in a warm glow, and there was a sense of peace here, something he hadn't experienced in years. For a moment, he felt out of place, as if he had wandered into a dream. The man led him to a large study where a woman sat behind a desk, her back to him. She was older than the woman from the street but carried herself with the same air of quiet authority. "Ah," she said without turning around. "You must be the boy. I've been waiting for you." The boy took a step forward, his legs shaking. "How did you know I was coming?" The woman finally turned, her gaze meeting his with a knowing smile. "We've been watching you. Your courage, your determination, it hasn't gone unnoticed." He stared at her, unsure whether to believe her. But there was no doubt in her eyes. She was speaking the truth. "Sit," she said gently, gesturing to a chair across from her. "Tell me your name." The boy hesitated before answering. "I'm Tomas." "Well, Tomas," the woman said, her voice warm yet firm, "I'm glad you decided to come. You have potential. But it's not just about dreams. It's about taking action, pushing forward even when the world tries to knock you down. Are you ready for that?" Tomas nodded, his heart racing. This was it. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for his entire life. No one, not even the cruel stranger who had mocked his dreams, could take this from him. "I'm ready," Tomas said, his voice steady. The woman smiled. "Good. Then let's begin." Tomas spent the next few days learning, absorbing as much as he could. He was trained in skills he had never imagined: reading, writing, negotiation, and strategy. He was given tasks and responsibilities that were far beyond his years, but he embraced them all with the same intensity that had driven him to dream in the first place. The house, the people, and the lessons all began to mold him into someone new. Several months later, Tomas stood in the same marketplace where he had first met the cruel stranger. But this time, he wasn't the same boy. His posture was straight, his eyes confident, and his clothes, though simple, were far more refined than the ragged ones he had once worn. As he passed the fountain, he saw the man who had mocked him months ago. The stranger was standing in front of a stall, laughing with a group of wealthy men, but when he saw Tomas, his laughter faltered. Tomas smiled to himself. He didn't need to say a word. The cruel stranger's face fell as he recognized him, but Tomas simply turned and walked on, knowing that his dream was now his reality. The boy who had once been laughed at had become the man everyone would soon respect. And the world would see, no one, no matter how cruel or dismissive, could ever steal his dreams again. Tomas walked through the streets with a quiet confidence, his new life becoming more and more apparent with each passing day. The man who had once mocked him, who had stood in the market and laughed at his dreams, was now a distant memory. But Tomas didn't forget. His dream had always been bigger than the cruel words of others. As he passed through the marketplace that day, he noticed the people around him with new eyes. They were all caught in their own routines, their lives unchanged, while he was on the cusp of something far greater. He had come from nothing, but now he was shaping his own future. He had earned his place in the world of the wealthy and powerful. The woman who had helped him, who had given him a chance, had guided him with care, teaching him more than just the skills needed to survive. She had taught him the values of persistence, humility, and the importance of lifting others as you rise. It wasn't just about personal gain. It was about building something meaningful with the resources and opportunities you were given. In the months since his arrival, Tomas had proven himself. His resilience, intelligence, and work ethic had earned him the respect of those who once saw him as just another orphan. He had quickly gained the trust of the leaders who had taken him under their wing, and now he was sitting at the head of meetings that once would have seemed far out of reach. He wasn't just another dreamer anymore, he was a force to be reckoned with. But Tomas still felt the weight of the journey. There were moments, brief flashes, when the life he had once known would sneak back in, when the memories of cold nights in alleyways, the hunger, and the ridicule would threaten to overwhelm him. He had come so far, but the scars of the past were still there. And yet, they didn't break him, they fueled him. Every challenge he faced, every setback, was a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he could go. One afternoon, as Tomas sat at his desk, poring over documents and letters, a soft knock at the door interrupted his concentration. He looked up to see one of his colleagues, a man named Alden, standing in the doorway. "Mr. Tomas," Alden said with a respectful nod, "there's someone here to see you." "He says it's urgent?" Tomas raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" "He wouldn't say, but he looks like someone who could use your help. He insists on speaking with you." Tomas stood up, his curiosity piqued. "Show him in." A moment later, a disheveled man entered, his clothes ragged, his face gaunt. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His eyes, however, were sharp, and he walked with the kind of urgency that made Tomas' heart race. "What is it?" Tomas asked, his voice steady but with a hint of concern. "What do you need?" The man hesitated before speaking, his voice trembling slightly. I know who you are, sir. I know what you've done. And I need your help." Tomas studied him, sensing the weight of his words. "Who are you?" "I'm from the old part of town," the man said, his eyes flicking nervously to the door. "I've heard the stories. The people are talking, sir, about the boy who once had nothing but dreams, and how he turned those dreams into reality." Tomas remained silent, allowing the man to continue. "There's a boy," the man said, "a child. He's an orphan, just like you were. He has dreams, but he's being hunted by the people who own the streets, by the ones who profit off of the misery of the rest of us. They want to crush his dreams before they even begin." Tomas' heart clenched as he listened. The boy's story sounded too familiar. The same cruelty, the same hopelessness that he had once faced, was now threatening another child. "Where is he?" Tomas asked, his voice low but resolute. The man swallowed hard. "He's hiding in the alleys near the market. I thought, maybe you could help him. Give him a chance, like someone gave you." Tomas stood up, his mind already racing with possibilities. This was no longer just about him. He had been given a chance he had worked tirelessly to earn, and now it was time to pass that opportunity on to someone else. "I'll help him," Tomas said without hesitation. "Take me to him." The boy was hiding in a narrow alley behind a crumbling building, his back pressed against the wall as he tried to keep his presence hidden. Tomas could see the fear in his eyes even from a distance, the kind of fear that came from years of being ignored, neglected, and threatened. The boy had no idea who Tomas was or what he had accomplished, but Tomas recognized the spark in his eyes. It was the same spark that had driven him all those years ago. The man who had led Tomas to the boy stepped forward, calling to him in a low voice. "It's all right, lad. There's someone here who wants to help." The boy flinched, instinctively drawing back. But Tomas stepped forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm not here to hurt you," Tomas said. "I'm here to help." The boy's eyes narrowed, unsure if he could trust the man in front of him. He had learned to distrust everyone, especially those who promised help. But Tomas didn't move any closer. He simply knelt down to the boy's level, offering him a chance to speak. "I used to be like you," Tomas said softly. "I used to think no one cared. But there's always a way out of the darkness. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step." The boy's face softened, though his uncertainty remained. "You not like them?" Tomas shook his head. "No, I'm not like them. I'm here to give you a chance. But you have to trust me." For a long moment, the boy stared at Tomas, his eyes searching for any hint of deception. Tomas offered him nothing but sincerity. Finally, the boy nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I want to get out of here," the boy whispered. "I want to be more than this." Tomas smiled, standing up. "Then come with me. I'll show you how to make that dream a reality." The boy hesitated, but Tomas extended his hand. Without another word, the boy took it. Tomas could feel the weight of that moment, the boy's fragile hope, the trust he had just placed in him. Tomas took the boy to a small safe house, a place he had arranged for those who were in need. There, they met with a few trusted allies, people Tomas had met during his own rise, people who now understood the importance of giving others a chance. They began to teach the boy the same lessons Tomas had learned: how to read, how to navigate the world, how to think beyond the confines of the streets. As the boy grew in confidence, so did Tomas. He watched with pride as the child began to shape his own path. Tomas knew that this was only the beginning, that just as he had been given a chance, so too could this boy rise from the ashes of his past. Months passed, and the boy flourished. His once shaky steps had turned into firm strides, and his dreams, once dismissed by the world, were beginning to take shape. Tomas often thought back to the man who had mocked him all those months ago. The cruel stranger who had laughed at his dream was now nothing more than a distant memory. In his place stood a boy who had learned that anything was possible with the right guidance and support. One day, as Tomas walked through the streets with the boy by his side, he caught sight of a familiar face. It was the man who had once laughed at him, the same man, now older, dressed in fine clothes, still walking the streets with the same air of superiority. He didn't recognize Tomas at first, but as Tomas approached, the man's eyes widened in recognition. Tomas stopped in front of him, the boy standing by his side, watching intently. The man blinked, then took a step back, his smile faltering. "Do you remember me?" Tomas asked, his voice calm but firm. The man's face tightened. "You're that street rat. The one who was always dreaming. What do you want?" Tomas smiled. "I just wanted to let you know that I've made something of myself." "And the boy standing beside me?" He glanced down at the boy, who met the stranger's gaze with a quiet, steady look. "He'll do the same." The man opened his mouth to respond but found no words. He looked from Tomas to the boy, then back to Tomas, but there was nothing he could say to that. The cruel laughter that had once defined him faded into silence, and the streets, for the first time, seemed to belong to Tomas. The boy was no longer just surviving. He was thriving. And Tomas, who had once been dismissed, now stood taller than ever before, not just as a man who had succeeded, but as someone who had made a difference. And in that, he found the true power of dreams, no matter how big or small. As Tomas and the boy walked through the streets, The weight of their shared experience began to take root in his heart. The boy, once timid and unsure of his place in the world, was now beginning to carve out a life of his own. The transition had been slow at first, but Tomas had seen the boy's transformation, not just in his actions but in his eyes. The boy no longer looked at the world with fear, but with the same quiet determination that had driven Tomas for so many years. It was early one evening when Tomas received word from one of his allies, an invitation to a gathering of influential leaders in the city. The gathering was said to be a meeting of minds, a chance to discuss the future of the city and the ways in which those in power could elevate the lives of those who had been overlooked for so long. Tomas knew that this was an opportunity too significant to ignore. It wasn't just a chance for him to be heard, it was a chance to take what he had learned and what he had been able to give the boy and spread that influence to others. The boy, now named Elias, had come a long way since Tomas had first found him. He was beginning to see his own potential, his future unfolding in front of him as he learned to speak with authority, to question the status quo, and to envision a life that was no longer confined by the streets. Elias was eager to take the next steps, to be part of something bigger than himself. "I think it's time for you to see it," Tomas said, glancing over at Elias as they walked through the city streets toward their destination. "See what?" Elias asked, his curiosity piqued. "The world that you can one day help shape," Tomas replied, his voice low but filled with purpose. "There's a meeting tonight, a gathering of people who have the power to make real change. And it's time you learned how to navigate it." Elias hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his eyes filled with an understanding that only came after the countless lessons Tomas had shared with him over the past months. Elias had come to realize that he wasn't just here to survive, he was here to make a difference. When they arrived at the large estate where the gathering was to take place, Tomas couldn't help but feel a mixture of anticipation and unease. This was a place he had never imagined walking into as a child. It was a world of polished floors, golden chandeliers, and polished smiles, things that, just months ago, had seemed entirely foreign to him. But now, Tomas had learned how to move through these spaces with the same ease that had once come so naturally in the back alleys. "Stay close," Tomas instructed Elias as they entered the grand hall. "These people have a way of making the world feel small, but remember, your voice matters just as much as anyone's here." Elias nodded, his expression determined as he looked around the room filled with city leaders, business owners, and influential individuals who had shaped the city's prosperity. The meeting began with formal introductions, and Tomas watched closely as those around him exchanged pleasantries, their faces painted with false smiles. He had been in these rooms before, and while he had learned to navigate them, there was still an underlying bitterness that came with seeing how easily the powerful held their wealth and influence over the struggling masses. "This is the real world," Tomas whispered to Elias as they stood on the edge of the group, observing the interactions. "But it doesn't have to be the world we live in forever." Elias turned his gaze toward Tomas. "You mean we can change things?" His voice held a quiet determination, a question mixed with hope. Tomas smiled. "We can. But it takes more than just dreaming. It takes action." As the discussions began, Tomas remained silent, observing. He had learned that in these circles, action often meant knowing when to speak and when to listen. He had seen many opportunities slip by when people failed to listen closely to what others were saying, and more importantly, to what they weren't saying. The topic of the night was the state of the city's orphanages, the conditions in which children like Elias had been left to fend for themselves. Tomas felt his heart tighten as the conversation veered toward funding cuts and ways to minimize the impact of charity programs, all in the name of economic efficiency. The words of the cruel stranger echoed in his mind. "You're just a street urchin. Nothing more, nothing less." Tomas clenched his fists, but he stayed silent, waiting for the right moment to make his presence known. Elias, on the other hand, was growing restless. His eyes narrowed as he listened to the talk of profit margins and economic models that made little to no mention of the children who suffered the consequences of such decisions. He had been in those streets, seen the lives of the children who were ignored and forgotten, and something inside him burned at the injustice. Tomas felt a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," he said softly to Elias. Without another word, Elias stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the group of leaders at the table. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but carried an undeniable force. "Excuse me," Elias said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think there's something you've missed." The room fell silent, all eyes on the boy who had spoken. Tomas felt a flicker of pride in his chest, even though he knew the weight of what Elias was about to say could shift the entire conversation. One of the leaders, a man in his 60s with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze, raised an eyebrow. "And who might you be, young man?" he asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled condescension. "My name is Elias," the boy said boldly. "And I was once like the children you're discussing. I was once homeless, an orphan, left to starve and fend for myself. I lived in the streets, just like them." His voice rose as he spoke, no longer a timid child but someone who had discovered his own power. "You talk about profits, about efficiency. But what about the lives of the children you're discussing? What about their futures?" The man with the sharp suit smirked. "And what exactly would you have us do, young boy? Do you think you can solve the problem with just a few words?" Elias stepped closer to the table, his eyes unwavering. "I don't have all the answers. But I know what it feels like to be left behind. To have dreams that no one believes in." He looked around at the other leaders. "I used to dream of a better life, of a chance to make something of myself. But I never had the opportunity to be more than what people thought I was." There was a long pause in the room as Elias's words hung in the air. Tomas could see that something had shifted. Elias had done what Tomas had always hoped for, that moment where his own voice, his own power, became undeniable. "Maybe it's time you start looking at the problem differently," Elias continued. "Maybe it's time you stop seeing orphans as burdens, and start seeing them as people. People who can be trained, who can be given opportunities to contribute to society, to help solve the very problems you're trying to avoid. You can give us the tools to build a better future. But you have to stop treating us like we're invisible." Tomas couldn't help but feel a rush of pride. The boy who had once lived in the shadows had stepped into the light, and his voice, powerful, clear, and full of truth, was ringing through the room. The leaders exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others skeptical, but there was no denying the impact Elias's words had made. Tomas knew this moment wouldn't pass without consequences, but he also knew that Elias had done something that few others could. He had spoken truth into a room full of people who had spent their lives avoiding it. Finally, the man in the sharp suit spoke, his tone less dismissive than before. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "it's time we reconsidered our approach." Tomas felt his chest swell with pride. It wasn't the victory he had imagined, not yet. But it was a step in the right direction. Elias had stood tall, and with his words, he had changed the course of the conversation. The night ended with no immediate resolution, but the spark had been lit. Tomas knew that Elias had begun something important. A movement, a conversation that would carry on long after the night had ended. As they left the gathering, Tomas placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You did it," Tomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Elias looked up at him, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "I didn't do it alone," he replied softly. "You showed me that I could have a voice." Tomas smiled, knowing that his journey was far from over, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Together, they were shaping something bigger than themselves. A future where dreams, no matter how impossible, had the chance to become a reality. As the weeks passed, the ripple effect of Elias's words at the meeting began to spread throughout the city. What had started as a single conversation about the plight of the orphans had turned into a broader discussion about social responsibility and the way the city's most vulnerable populations were treated. Tomas knew that the path forward wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that their actions had begun to shift something deep within the city's power structure. Elias, for his part, had become something of a local hero. His boldness and courage had sparked a fire in others who had long felt ignored or dismissed. Tomas watched with pride as Elias continued to speak out, sometimes in meetings, other times in the streets, but always with an unshakable resolve. Tomas had given Elias a chance, but now Elias was beginning to shape his own future, to take the lessons Tomas had taught him and apply them in ways that Tomas hadn't even anticipated. However, as much as the movement grew, the backlash was inevitable. Those who had profited off the city's inequality were not willing to give up their advantages without a fight. It wasn't long before Tomas began to feel the weight of that resistance. The pressure from the elite circles he had once navigated so easily grew heavier, the whispers in the halls more frequent, the cold stares more pronounced. Tomas had learned to deal with these obstacles before, but this time it wasn't just his reputation at stake. It was Elias's future and the future of all the orphans Tomas had sworn to protect. One evening, as Tomas sat in his office, going over the latest reports, a soft knock came at the door. He looked up, and there stood Elias, his face set in that same determined expression that had become so familiar in recent months. "What's going on?" Tomas asked, setting aside the papers. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Elias stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "I think I am," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of concern. "I've been meeting with more of the leaders, business owners, city council members, and I'm hearing things I don't like." Tomas raised an eyebrow, motioning for Elias to sit. "What kind of things?" Elias hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Some of them are trying to push back against what we've started. They're saying that we're creating instability, that the programs we've put in place for the orphans and the poor are hurting the city's economy. They're pushing for cuts, even threatening to shut down some of the initiatives we've worked so hard to put in place." Tomas frowned, the weight of Elias's words sinking in. "I thought we had their support. We've made progress." "We have," Elias agreed. "But there's always resistance when you try to change the system. There are people who don't want that to happen. And I think they're going to try and make an example out of us." Tomas leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he considered the situation. He knew this was coming. The changes they had made had been met with opposition from the start, but now the fight was becoming more real, more personal. This wasn't just about changing policies, it was about the very foundation of power that the city was built on. "They're trying to break us," Tomas said quietly. "But we won't let them." Elias looked up at him, his eyes filled with resolve. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I've realized that it's not enough to just talk about change. We need to show them that we won't back down, that we won't be intimidated. If we can stand together, we can make them see that the people we've helped are worth far more than their profits." Tomas smiled, proud of the strength Elias was showing. "That's exactly what we'll do. We'll make sure our voices are heard louder than ever. But we'll need to be strategic. We can't just walk in and demand things. We have to show them why what we're doing is important, not just for us, but for the future of the city." Elias nodded. "I agree. We need to take the fight to them in a way they can't ignore." In the days that followed, Tomas and Elias began to organize their efforts. They reached out to the communities they had worked with, gathering support from the people who had benefited from their programs. Tomas knew that the only way to stand up to the powerful elites was to create a movement that was not just rooted in idealism, but in the tangible results of the work they had done. The orphans, the poor, the marginalized, they were all part of the city's heartbeat, and their collective voice would be stronger than any one man's agenda. They began to hold rallies, bringing together not only the people who had directly benefited from their initiatives but also those who simply believed in the cause. The streets filled with people, young and old, who came together to demand their place in the city. Elias spoke at every rally, his words growing more powerful with each speech. His once timid demeanor had transformed into the confident voice of a leader who knew that what they were fighting for was worth every sacrifice. Tomas, ever the strategist, worked behind the scenes, meeting with influential allies and rallying support from the business owners who still believed in the vision they had set out to create. He knew that the fight would take time, that they would need to push forward with both strength and diplomacy. But with Elias by his side, he felt a renewed sense of hope. They had built something real, something that had touched the lives of so many, and that was not something anyone could take away. One evening, after another successful rally, Tomas and Elias sat on the steps of the safe house, catching their breath after the long day. The city was alive around them, the sound of people talking and moving through the streets filling the air. "You've done it, Elias," Tomas said, his voice filled with pride. "You've turned into the leader I always knew you could be." Elias smiled, though there was a weary look in his eyes. I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me the tools to believe in myself. Tomas nodded. And you've taken those tools and built something powerful. This fight is far from over, but we've come a long way. Elias glanced around at the bustling city, his gaze thoughtful. I never thought I'd be standing here, Tomas. I never thought I'd have the chance to make a difference. But now I can see it, the change, the possibility. And I know we're not done yet. Tomas's heart swelled with emotion. The boy who had once wandered the streets, hopeless and alone, was now a beacon of hope to so many. Together, they had built a movement, a force that couldn't be stopped. Whatever happens next, Elias, Tomas said, remember this, you're not just fighting for the future of the city. You're fighting for the future of every child who's ever been overlooked. You're fighting for those who have no voice. And that makes everything we're doing worth it? Elias nodded, his eyes focused on the horizon. I won't let them down. We won't. As the night fell, the city around them seemed to hum with possibility. Tomas and Elias knew that the battle ahead would be long, but they also knew that with every step they took, they were changing the future, not just for themselves, but for every person who believed that their dreams could become a reality. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning, organizing, and speaking out. Tomas and Elias knew that the fight they were waging was not just about changing a few policies. It was about tearing down the deeply entrenched systems of power that had kept the city's most vulnerable populations in their place for so long. But the opposition wasn't letting up. The wealthy elites who had once ignored their actions were now actively trying to discredit them, using every tool at their disposal to undermine the growing movement. They spread rumors, bought up media space, and paid off influencers in the city to attack the cause. They wanted to make Tomas and Elias look like fools, like naive dreamers who were trying to change the city for the worse. Tomas had expected this resistance, but the intensity of it still shook him. It was one thing to fight against indifference. It was another to fight against a well-oiled machine of power. He knew the stakes were high, but seeing the lengths to which the elites were willing to go was a reminder of just how much they stood to lose if the city's power structures were ever truly challenged. One evening, as they were preparing for another public rally, Tomas and Elias met in the safe house, going over their strategy for the upcoming event. Elias had become a master at public speaking, his words powerful and galvanizing, while Tomas worked behind the scenes, coordinating logistics and ensuring that every detail was covered. We need to focus on the success stories, Tomas said as he flipped through a folder of documents. The people we've helped, the orphans who are now working, the families who are getting back on their feet. We need to remind them that this movement is already making a difference. Elias nodded, running his hand through his hair. I know, but it's getting harder. Every time we take one step forward, they push us 2 steps back. I can feel the pressure. People are starting to question if it's really worth it. Tomas walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You can't let their doubts cloud your vision, Elias. Every time they try to stop us, it means we're getting closer to the change we've been fighting for. We've already proven that we can make an impact. And now we have to show them that we won't back down. Elias met his gaze, his eyes burning with determination. I won't let them destroy everything we've built either. You won't, Tomas replied with a smile. Because we're not fighting alone. Look around you. Look at the people who believe in this cause, the ones who are ready to stand with us. Together, we're unstoppable. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their mission settling in. Elias had come so far from the boy who once wandered the streets, unsure of his place in the world. And Tomas had watched him grow, not just as a leader, but as someone who had learned to fight for what was right. They were both prepared for whatever was to come. The rally that evening was one of the largest yet. The streets were filled with people, families, workers, students, and the very orphans they had promised to help. There was a palpable energy in the air, an electricity that sparked with every step they took toward the center of the city. Tomas stood at the front of the crowd, watching as Elias prepared to take the stage. His heart swelled with pride. This was the moment. Elias had been building up to this, and now he was about to speak to an audience larger than any he had ever addressed before. Tonight is about us. Elias's voice rang out, amplified through the loudspeakers. It's about every person in this city who has been overlooked, ignored, and left behind. We are not just numbers. We are not just statistics. We are people, and we are ready to stand together. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy infectious. Elias paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. Tomas could see the resolve in his eyes, the understanding that this was more than just a speech. This was a turning point. For too long, the people who make the decisions have looked at us like we don't matter, Elias continued. They've tried to crush our dreams, our hope, and our future. But we're here tonight to tell them that we are not afraid. We will not back down. We will not stop fighting until every child, every family, and every person in this city has the opportunity to live the life they deserve. The crowd cheered louder, chanting his words, and Tomas felt a sense of unity like he had never known before. This wasn't just a movement, this was a revolution. But even as the crowd roared with support, Tomas could sense that the opposition was closing in. He had seen the signs, the small acts of sabotage, the whisper campaigns, and the attempts to discredit their efforts. The elites wouldn't go down without a fight. And soon, that fight would come to a head. The next morning, Tomas received an anonymous letter. It was simple, short, and to the point. Stop now or else. He stared at the letter for several moments, his mind racing. The threats had always been part of the fight. But this was different. The message wasn't just about intimidation, it was a warning. And the fact that it came anonymously meant that the people behind it were playing dirty. Tomas immediately gathered Elias and the other key members of their movement. They met in a small room at the safe house, their faces grim. They're not going to stop, Tomas said, showing them the letter. This is just the beginning. Elias looked up from the letter, his jaw tight. We can't let them scare us off. I don't plan to, Tomas replied. But we have to be smart about this. The more we push forward, the more they'll try to tear us down. We can't fight this battle on their terms. We need to stay one step ahead. One of their allies, a woman named Lila, spoke up. What if we take this fight to the people? We've got the support. We've got the momentum. We can't let them use their money and influence to intimidate us. Tomas nodded. That's what we're going to do. We need to go public. Make it clear that we're not afraid. We'll make sure the whole city knows what they're trying to do. Lila smiled, her eyes sharp. We've got their backs. Let's show them what we're made of. As Tomas looked around at the people in the room, he realized just how far they had come. These were people who had once been powerless, who had been written off as insignificant. And now, they were a force that couldn't be ignored. They spent the next few days preparing for their next move, organizing rallies, reaching out to local media outlets, and speaking to anyone who would listen. They were no longer just a group of rebels. They were a movement, a cause that had captured the hearts of the people. And nothing, not the threats nor the power of the elites, could extinguish the fire that had been ignited. The next rally was set for the following week, and this time, it was larger than ever. Thousands of people gathered in the city's central square, demanding change, justice, and the opportunity to live their lives with dignity. Elias stood on the stage once more, his voice steady and strong. This is just the beginning, he declared. We will not stop until every voice is heard. We will not rest until every person in this city has the opportunity to rise. Together, we are unstoppable. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Tomas stood in the back, watching Elias with pride. He had come a long way from the boy who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a dreamer. Now, he was a leader, and together, they were changing the city, one step at a time. But as the crowd cheered, Tomas knew that the real battle was just beginning. The elites would not back down easily, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But Tomas had faith in Elias, in the movement, and in the people who stood with them. And no matter what came next, they were ready.